Good afternoon. We will start now with the afternoon sessions. So I welcome the authors of these three presentations and the moderator, my colleague, Sarah. Sarah, the screen or the floor is yours.
Thank you, Isabel. We will now have a session with focus on late Gothic sculpture from Germany. We will have three presentations of 20 minutes and the discussion will be at the end. I remind the audience that they can write questions on the chat during the session and the speakers will answer them during the discussion. So I welcome the first speaker, which is Gab.Inovação. Gab, are you there? Oh, hello.
Yes, I'm here. Can you see me? Hi.
Yes, we can. So Wiebke studied technical art history and conservation with a focus on polychrome wood sculpture and panel painting at the Dresden Academy of Fine Arts. Since 2015, she has been working at the Institute für Kunsttechnik und Konservierung at the Germanisches National Museum in Nuremberg. Her research focuses on sculptural polychromy of the late Middle Ages and Renaissance panel painting. Now let's hear from Wiebke with a presentation entitled New Findings on the Original Surface Design of a Wooden Sculpture by Tillman Riemenschneider. So Wiebke, the screen is yours.
Okay, so thank you very much. I try to share the screen now. Do you see the presentation now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yes, so hello everybody. Many thanks for the introduction and the opportunity to join this interesting meeting and to share my work here. As Sarah told you, I'm a conservator at the Institute für Kunsttechnologie and Konservierung at the Germanisches Nationalmuseum in Nuremberg. The museum has a large collection of historical, cultural and artistic objects from the German-speaking region from the beginning of the history to the present. One focus of the art collection is on the late Middle Ages in Franconia, which is represented by numerous important works. Among them, a total of 8 sculptures from the workshop of Tillman Riemenschneider that you can see on the slide below. Before I come to the new findings on the original surface finish of St. Elizabeth, I will introduce the subject of provenance and selected features of the wooden support concerning the manufacturing process. St. Elizabeth on the left, created around 1510 and about 110 centimeters high, most probably comes from the central shrine of an altarpiece, to which 2 further sculptures may be assigned, which are now in private ownership in the US and in the Compton Verney Art Gallery in the UK. The figure in the middle is of St. Catherine, identified by the inscription Katerie on her undergarment. The female saint in the Compton Verney Art Gallery, image C, cannot be identified because the main attribute has been lost with her right hand. The 3 sculptures were presented together for the first time at the major Riemenschneider exhibition at the Met in 2000. After individual treatments over time, their surfaces look quite different today. From a technological point of view, in addition to the matching dimensions, one feature confirmed the assumption of togetherness. There's a vertical slit of about 5.7 centimeters in the middle of their backs at the shoulders to attach them with a hook or similar. These slits seem to be very specific, as there are no similar marks on other sculptures from the Riemenschneider workshop known. Also, the impressions of a two-prong clamping tool from the workbench, marked with white arrows in image C, match exactly as you can see in the overlay of the tracings from St. Elizabeth and the female saint in image D. The figures are each carved from a block of lime wood. In the case of St. Elizabeth, image A larger piece of a rope fold has been added originally. Also, there's a smaller original repair in the area of her right shoulder, where a knot had apparently been removed. The female saint also had an originally added piece of a fold, which is now lost. Several knots, however, remained in the wood, as you can see in images B and C. In the hollowed back, there are two pieces of wood added at the St. Elizabeth, image D, where the wood became too thin and was carved through. This technique of repairing with rather big chunks of wood is not unusual for the Riemenschneider workshop, even though there are only smaller repairings at St. Catherine and the female saint. But you can find it, for example, at the seated bishop from the cloister at the Met in image C. The surfaces of all figures are very finely crafted. The garments and attributes are decorated using both freehand carving techniques and various punchwork. Michel Marincola was the first to describe these decoration techniques in detail and identified 9 different tool marks that were used, including 3 different motif punch marks in the shapes of flowers, circles, and stars in image A. I would like to take a closer look at one technique, namely a punch pattern of rhombs with tiny circles in their centers in image B. The actual comparison has confirmed the suggestion that exactly the same tool was used on Elizabeth on the left and the female saint on the right. In the case of St. Elizabeth, the punch pattern on the high-necked undergarment can only be seen in the X-ray image, image A, as it is covered by later paint layers. At the female saint in image B, you find this pattern rotated by 90 degrees at the book's cover and in the same orientation at the clock's border. To make it clearer, the pattern of the punch was digitally reconstructed in image A. The wide side measures 1 centimeter, the short side 7 millimeters. In image B, the black and white raking light of a detail at the female saint's clock border shows very clearly how the punch tool was formed. The points marked with red arrows are raised, and the punch tool was struck into the wood with a minimal offset. In the case of the St. Elizabeth, the tool appears to have been stuck with less distance, and in some cases there is even a slight overlap, as you can see in image A. Although the wood quality was not perfect as described before, and as shown in figures A to C, due to the highly detailed surfaces with the subtle and shallow tooling, it was assumed early that these 3 sculptures were formerly so-called unpolychromed. However, neither wood defects and their repairs are reliable indications of a surface to be painted, nor are extremely finely finished surfaces exclusive indications of a surface not to be painted. Instead, only the characteristics of the oldest polychromy found, in addition to the original surface treatment beneath it, can provide reliable information. Due to the lack of relevant traces on the female saint and the St. Catherine, the new findings at St. Elizabeth are all the more important. Sorry, I now have a little technical problem, but yeah, okay. Significant indication that the sculptures were not painted originally are the stylistic and technological characteristics of the first polychromy found on St. Elizabeth. It succeeded to reconstruct this oldest polychromy almost completely, image D. It is dominated by gold and silver-plated surfaces, some of them with red glaze. Even the wheel was silver-plated. The investigation with different analysis methods produced the following results. The polychromy is oil-bound and it's based on a thin lead-white ground layer, layer 1 in the cross-section C. The silver and gold leaves were applied to a thick orange-brown mordant, layer 2 and 3. Smalt was identified as the blue pigment of the mantle lining. Above this oldest polychromy, there are 2 later ones that changed the appearance remarkable. For example, the former silver wheel became a plain white scarf with blue stripes, image D, and layer 4 and 5 in the cross-section. The bright blue overpaint was found on the outside of the cloak, which could be identified as Berlin blue, and therefore dates to the 18th century at the earliest. The observation that Marinkola made in 1998 about the residues of paint on St. Catherine and kindly made available to me shows some similarities. She described a very thin white ground layer, a thick orange-brown mordant, gold leaf, and a red glaze on it. She also described a later bright blue overpaint. According to the findings, the oldest polychromy does not appear to date back to the early 16th century, but to the 17th century at the earliest. As there are no further layers of paint under this, it must be assumed that this is the oldest polychromy of all. This seems to confirm the assumption that the sculptures were originally unpolychromed. In fact, there are corresponding findings of an original monochrome coating under the ground layer directly on the wooden surface. The remnants of a reddish coating, image B to D, can be found on the entire frontal surface. In most areas, the remains of the reddish coating are extremely thin or lost completely due to former cleaning and removal of paint layers, image B. But few remains are still quite thick and shiny with a pronounced inherent craquelure, image C and D. Some of them are accumulations such as drops or running marks, image D. Samples were taken in 4 different areas, as indicated by the red arrows in the mapping on the left, namely on the outside of the cloak, the dress, the wheel, and the face. As you can see in the cross sections, there is a thin, sparsely pigmented coating directly on the wooden surface without any dirt or dust in between. This coating was applied to the wood surface as a semi-transparent film-forming glaze. There is no evidence of a multi-layered structure. In the SEM BSE image, image C, a very fine white line can be seen on the top of the coating layer. It's marked with the red arrows, and the coating layer itself is marked with the white arrows. This could be a so-called plaster horizon. That means airborne particles that have accumulated on the surface. This could be therefore a further indication that this layer has been exposed to the atmosphere for a long time. The coloring particles can be easily seen in today's orange-brownish binder, image D. There are tiny red-brown and tiny light orange particles, as well as larger black ones. SEM EDX shows that the tiny light orange particles are minium and the darker red-brown particles are clay minerals. The black particles are carbon black, which could not be identified in more detail so far. Due to the morphology, it does not appear to be wine black, but perhaps soot or bister. A more precise identification was not possible with Raman spectroscopy on the cross-section used and would require analysis with GCMF, as described by Baumer et al. In 2019. As the FTIR spectrum shows, the binding agent is protein. The protein collagens were identified as bovine or Bos taurus. So the medium is most probably animal glue from cattle. It contains neither egg nor oil or jam additives, as has been published on other Riemenschneider sculptures in the past. While the reddish coating can be found on all frontal areas of the sculpture, the large gemstone on the mantle edge is accentuated more brightly. Image A shows the gemstone, image B a detail of it. The redder coloration is not due to a more concentrated pigmentation of the coating, but was achieved with a red glaze. According to the UV image of the cross-section, image E, it could be a red lake pigment in a resin. The eyes were painted black, image C. It looks as if the black paint is lying directly on the wood. No clear remains could be found on the lips. Here the findings rather indicate that just the reddish coating was used, perhaps a little more pigmented. Overall, the sculptures must therefore have had a monochrome reddish overall impression, whereby the coating was perhaps pigmented to varying degrees depending on the section. The findings presented here were compared with the findings on other wooden sculptures with monochrome surface finishes with a focus on Riemenschneider. It should be noted that monochrome coatings were found on almost all the sculptures examined, in which polychromy was either never applied or applied long afterwards the carving was completed. I would like to sum up the following two examples. As early as 1965, Eike Oellermann described a transparent brownish yellowish coating for the Rothenburg altarpiece of the Holy Blood, which contains, according to analysis at that time, egg white, oil, very little ochre, gypsum, white lead, maybe as associative, and wine black. This coating was applied in a modeling manner and probably twice in some cases. The glaze was evidently applied when the shrine was already assembled. Those parts of the sculptures that were later concealed in the shrine are not coated. Drops and traces of the glaze could be found on these areas. A red lip mark and a black eye mark could be found under the coating directly on the wood. Oellermann's findings on the Münnerstadt altarpiece were supplemented by Rudolf Goebel in the late 1990s. While Oellermann described a transparent yellowish coating that should have penetrated deep into the wood and supposedly contained mainly protein with small amounts of oil as well as iron oxide pigments, lead white and wine black, Goebel used HPLC to detect a yellow natural dye in the uppermost wood substance, maybe morin. Since the dye was found in the wood substance and the pigments in the layer on the surface, it is not entirely clear whether there are two layers or processes involved. The common interpretation is of one yellow dye medium, similar to a stain, which penetrated the wood, and one proteinous pigmented coating above it. This raises the question whether the structure of the wood, as well as knots and repairs, would have been enhanced by a colored stain if it had been applied first. As in the Rothenburg altarpiece, the eyes were accentuated under the coating in black and the lips in red. Due to these observations, I paid particular attention to the penetration depth of the coating itself and to the question of the presence of a natural yellow dye. To determine the penetration depth, I used the staining of proteins with hyperruby. This shows a slight reaction in the upper cell structures of the wood, image A. The glue seems to have penetrated the wood slightly, but of course there are no colored components in the wood structures. The dark red particles in the wood structure that you can see in the UV image of the untreated cross-section in image C are only natural ingredients of the wood, as you can see in the microsection of a natural lime wood sample in image D. To compare the penetration depth of a usual glue solution, I applied a 3% animal glue solution twice to a piece of fresh lime wood in image B. The staining with hyperruby shows a similar, perhaps slightly higher penetration depth than on the original sample A. Since we do not know how deeply the yellow dye penetrated the wood at the Münnerstadt altarpiece, we can only speculate whether the dye could have been applied using a proteinous medium, perhaps the coating itself. In this case, it is also conceivable that Riemenschneider first applied an unpigmented, low-concentrated glue solution to close the pores, perhaps smoothed the wood again, and only then applied the pigmented coating. The assumption that there might be a yellow dye in the wood arose during surface cleaning. After the removal of a younger dark brown coating, the wood surface appeared slightly shiny and in a slightly yellowish reddish brown tone. For cleaning, the brown coating was softened with water-loaded nano-restore gels, image A, and then removed with cotton rollers, image B. It was noticeable that the nanogel turned strongly yellow when applied to the already cleaned wood surface, leaving behind a matter and lighter-looking wood surface. The nanogel was therefore only used to soften the coating, but not to clean the wood surface afterwards. In order to clarify whether constituent parts of the wood as degradation products of the lignin were dissolved or possibly a yellow dye, samples of the yellow nanogel were analyzed with HPLC. No natural yellow dye could be analyzed. Instead, similarities with fluff-aniline, a modern synthetic yellow dye, were found. The origin of the modern dye is unclear, and the results are still being analyzed. Conclusion. To summarize, the most recent investigation confirmed the assumption that the three sculptures belong together. Furthermore, it could be clearly proven that St. Elizabeth, and thus very probably both other sculptures, were originally so-called unpolychromed or monochromed. The complex discussion about the naming of this phenomenon, especially the German naming, is old but still highly topical. To this day, varying terms are used for one and the same phenomenon, especially in Germany. The greatest ambiguity, however, is still over the reasons that led to unpolychromed surfaces, and thus over the question whether or when a sculpture with an unpolychromed surface was considered as to be finished. This topic has been the subject of much controversial debate in recent decades, but I can't go into it deeper here. In this case, the findings suggest that the sculptures had a monochrome, slightly reddish overall impression, with lips and eyes marked as well as details like gemstones. Image B is intended to give a restrained impression of what the surface might have looked like. As the surface of Elizabeth is largely covered with later paint layers, I chose the female saint for the reconstruction here. In comparison with the findings on other Riemenschneider sculptures, similarities but also differences could be identified. The monochrome pigmentation and animal glue as a binder are consistent with most of the other results. However, neither a multi-layered structure nor the coloration with a natural dye, as proven for the Münnerstadt altarpiece, could be detected. I would like to note at this point that it is always difficult to compare results obtained over such a long period of time and using different analytical methods. In the case of St. Elizabeth, final analyses are still to be carried out on the original coating to clarify the results to date. In addition to the pending identification of the black pigment, the presence of a natural dye should be ruled out with absolute certainty. As the dye analysis carried out was on the extraction of substances from the wood, it would be desirable also to test the coating itself for dyes. Moreover, it would be worthwhile to carry out further comparative studies on monochrome sculptures using a uniform approach and the same analysis methods. Now I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Vibeke. Very interesting presentation. So we will now go to the second presentation of this session by Niva Kunz. Is Niva here already? Vibeke, can you stop sharing?
Sorry, yes, it was.
Thank you very much.
No.
Thank you very much.
Sorry.
So I was calling Niva. I don't know if she's already here or not. Yeah. Okay. Hello, Niva. You are muted. Oh,
No problem. I'm sorry.
no problem. So, hello.
Hello.
Niva, I will present Niva. Niva Kuntis graduated from the Bern University of Applied Sciences in the spring of 2024. Completing her MA degree in conservation and restoration, she focused on sculptures of winged altarpieces of the canton of Graubünden in Switzerland and conducted studies on flesh-toned polychromies. While doing internships in the field of conservation and restoration, she finished her previous BA studies in historical linguistics in 2018. So now let's hear from Niva with her presentation called Exploring the Creation of Carnations in Historical Written Sources, Integrating Historical Manuscripts into the Study of Flesh-Toned Polychromy on Sculptures. So But the screen is yours.
Yes, I tried to. Share my screen. Can you see like the shared screen correctly?
Yes, we have, but there's a box, I believe, on the, yes. Now
No.
that's perfect. Yes, thank you very much.
Okay. So, okay, I welcome you to the presentation exploring the creation of carnations in historical written sources, integrating historical manuscripts into the study of flesh tone polychromy on sculptures. I will start the presentation with some background information about the research and the study of carnations on sculptures in general, before I will elaborate further on how written sources may or may not contribute to their understanding. The term carnate, used for painted skin, derives from incarnation, that is, becoming flesh, and was initially reserved for Christian mysticism. The study of carnation is not entirely new, but overall it's still relatively sparsely researched. As you can see from the quote of the Italian lyricist Dolce, the creation of human skin was still considered to be somehow special. As he is saying loosely translated, that surely the color scheme is of such importance and power that a painter, when he imitates well the tones and softness of the flesh and the peculiarities of all things, achieves that his figures look alive, as if they were only missing their breath. Core areas of the study of carnation deal with the materiality, structure, and technical implementation, similarities, differences, as well as the preserved surface aesthetics of the carnate. The inclusion of transmitted knowledge can, as we will try to argue, also contribute to the understanding. It is presumed that the painting of faces is a craft to which special importance was attributed, which can be reinforced by historical sources and documents. There are indications that the technique required special practice and that the painting of faces was mostly carried out either by or under the supervision of a master. So the studies were motivated by researches and restoration works on the altarpiece in Brienz in Switzerland. Doing investigations on the flesh tones of the highlighted gold sculptures, the aim was to find background information in historical written sources which could help to support the archaeological research. While working there, it was also possible to take samples from a related altarpiece situated nearby, which is dated only some few years after the one in Brienz and supposed to be constructed by the same laborers, namely the workshop of Ivo Striegel, which, even though the master was not alive anymore at this time, was said to be one of the most influential of southern Germany in this period. Here samples of these female sculptures were taken. However, the manner the flesh tone polychromy in both altarpieces were composed turned out to be quite dissimilar. For the research, cross-sections of microsamples were used to make conclusions about the stratigraphy. The components were detected mainly through FTIR and SEM analysis. The focus was set on basic skin tones and on red parts like the cheeks. We take a first look on the findings in Brienz, illustrated here on the visible samples. We can observe the following peculiarities. We can see a two-layered structure of the paint, which has already been observed in other late quartic carnations before. The presence of protein as a component in the oily paint layer is an observation that has been seen repeatedly in flesh tones on sculptures and has been discussed in more detail by Tyson Tenen. A layer between the actual primer and the paint layer also has been repeatedly observed, and apparently there is red dye, which has been specifically used for red tones. So to find some hints, we will now take a look on written sources. In 1649, Pacheco wrote that there is a lot to say about the carnations on sculptures. Regarding this quote, it's important to mention that even though it's evident that there would indeed be a lot to say about this topic, explicit mentions of how to do carnations on sculptures seem to be very rare, and unfortunately, Pacheco is often quoted as the only reliable author. At least it's safe to say that a lot of manuscripts actually do mention mixtures and advices for the implementation of flesh tones. Regarding the technique, however, a lot of descriptions tend to include complex paint layers with linear details, which rather hint to panel paintings or illuminating techniques and would have to be adapted for a plastic support. As I will try to show, there are still some hints that sculptures might be included regardlessly. So an attempt was made to find out more about how the carnations are actually treated in written sources. So in order to do so, we were looking for keywords like membrana, flesh tones, or carnations in manuscripts. The main focus was set on sources of the 15th till the mid-16th century. Mostly they derive from nowadays Germanic, French, or Alemannic-speaking areas. Some other older manuscripts, which seem to have been still quite influential in this period, were included as well. I was noticed by Clark, not only the content of such manuscript might seem complex, but also sometimes to pinpoint the origin and background of the author and the quoted manuscripts. The discussion whether certain techniques may or may not be described by the author seems to mirror the structure and the historical context of the manuscript, which for nowadays readers might seem somehow confusing. This is especially the case for written sources offering equally information about carnate, painting, and wooden supports, and are therefore valuable for our research. However, if we read, for example, the prologue of Theophilus, it becomes evident that the author's intention is to provide the reader with all the knowledge which is needed to engage in the various arts. This is very much in line with the later Manuscrit de Montpellier. Therefore, it might be reasonable to look at the manuscript as a kind of toolbox, providing the reader with the technical background and advices. As seen by the quote, we will often find a collection of various arts, so there are for sure some topics we already can exclude. However, hints that sculptures can be included could, for example, be mentions of specific terms, where it seems to be a linguistic choice of some authors that they might well be linked more to sculptures than to panel paintings of humans. Also, the way the preparation of ground layers are treated sometimes might provide some evidences. And of course, the way the colors are applied, especially when mentioned for figures. So the task is now to correctly link the individual chapters to the corresponding pigment techniques and binders. In some manuscripts, step-by-step advices for the application of skin tones do exist. Yet, one of the first conclusions was that not only binding agents and support are hardly mentioned in the same receipt, but even the mixture of the pigments for the flesh tone themselves. This leaves room for interpretation. Although one will have a hard time to find clear instructions for the creation of carnations on sculpture, the writings at least reveal tendencies, issues, and tactics with which the respective contemporaries were struggling. However, there are indications suggesting that pigment selection was not fundamentally different based on technique alone. The manuscript de Montpellier mentions that on wood the same colors may be applied as on page, but their binders are different. So let's take a look on the binders. The sources primarily focus on oily binders, which apparently was attributed high quality early on. Occasionally mentions for other binders such as gums, animal glue, or egg can be found, with Giannini's egg tempera being a popular example. However, predominantly, there seems to be a trend of intergenerational finding ways to optimize oil painting. Theophilus describes the drying of oil paint as a lengthy process, but as more sophisticated recipes for dealing with this issue emerge, there is a progression towards more nuanced approaches. The developments range from adding bone ash and thickening the sun to intentional use of secretive pigments and recipes for preparing oil by boiling it with Galician stone, pulverized bone, and pumice stone to optimize the technical properties. However, there is little evidence of the addition of protein components into the oil paint, such as we found evidence on the samples, except perhaps in the Marciana manuscript, but here it's more due to the mixing of the pigments in the according binders. Overall, there are indications that the interaction between pigments and binder was given early attention. Advices for thickening the oil in the sun and the preference for the use of aged oil prove evidence for a rather high viscosity of the binder. However, the Strasbourg and Colmar manuscripts mention that it should have the consistency of an oatmeal once mixed with pigments. Even though it's hard to tell how thick a medieval porridge actually was, it seems to hint to a rather heavy texture, which can be reassured by sources like the Codex of Solothurn, mentioning the thicker the oil, the better it is. Yet, there was still room to lower the viscosity by adding more oil or varnish before applying it. As mentioned, many of the manuscripts will describe a multi-layered application of the paint for flesh tones. A very advanced example can be found in the Liber de Illuminarum. This, of course, may also be referring to panel painting. Interestingly, the Liber mentions that the basic mixture should be applied 2 times before painting details and outlines, where the first paint layer should be left to dry before applying the second one. So here we will again find strong evidence for an oil binder, as details such as highlight should be applied when the paint is still wet. Like on many other sculptures, we also found evidence on the carnations of Bryans that the original application of the transition from blush to skin tone was most likely applied wet in wet. Among other manuscripts who make similar recommendation, the manuscript de Montpellier explicitly mentions that for figures, always 2 to 3 layers should be applied, where the former ones should be of weaker color than the upper ones. This is pretty much in line with the findings in the altarpiece of Bryans, which show 2 paint layers, of which the upper one is more saturated. Overall, it seems that the choice of pigments was made based on the various criteria, with availability obviously playing an important role. When trying to roughly trace the development of pigment selection for flesh painting, some trends can be observed. So from the 15th century onwards, 2 known ingredients seem to have been increasingly used, which were hardly mentioned for the base tone of the skin before, namely chalk and the sort of red dye, often referred to as Paris red. This pigment was, as the illustration shows, also used in the basic flesh tone, but of course occurs even more often, especially for red parts. So in terms of pigment selection, the flesh tones of the Bryans altarpiece are quite in line with the trend of the time. However, upon closer examination of the samples of the sculptures, it was observed that there appears to be a significant higher protein content, particularly in the red of the cheek. There seems to be a correlation between the protein present in agglomerates and the red dye, as it often aligned with SEM measurements indicating the presence of dye. This connection was also noted in the flesh tones of the related winged altarpiece in Bivio, which we will discuss further. Various source materials and descriptions of manufacturing process for the pigment can be found in historical texts, including boiling wool fabrics to recover the dye, which could explain the deposition of the color-producing substance, which is here alizarin on a protein substrate. Overall, it seems reasonable to consider binders and pigments not as separate entities, but as a part of a cohesive system. However, if we look on the carnations of the altarpiece in Bivio, we find no traces of cinnabar at all, even though it's mentioned in almost every manuscript for the basic mixture of carnates. Instead, minium, as indicated by the arrow in the middle, was used. And the stratigraphic differences compared to the altarpiece in Brienz, that's yet another proof of the diversity of implementation at this period of time. What we also can see is that there seems to be an orange layer under the upper paint layer of the cheeks, which was apparently also pigmented with minium. For the rest of the skin of the sculpture in Bivio, the former strongly colored layer under the cheeks is absent. Directly under this layer, we will find another layer which shows lead pigment and can also be seen on the temple. There we will again find, as in Brienz, a kind of modified ground layer which shows visible traces of oil. So we can see a kind of complex multi-layer, still mainly with protein prepared system directly below the main paint layer of the skin tone. Regarding the possible functions of such layers, they could, as seen on the cheeks of the sculptures in Bivio, well be included in the surface aesthetics. However, if we look at the quote, it seems also possible that different functions may have been attributed to them, like the acceleration of the drying properties of the upper paint layers. A layer which also shows already oil components, like the modified ground layer, could also reduce the absorbency of the upper paint layer. However, in the case of the observed sculptures, it seems also possible that the pigmented ground layer already was a first outline of the color scheme, since on the cheeks more minium can be observed, whereas on other parts it's rather lead white. Like this, it would already be clear where to put the red parts when finishing the polychromy. So although the function of the preparation layers is not in all cases entirely clear, they were described by various researchers on polychrome sculptures. In the written source, a finish of the ground layer with lead white is often recommended. It can either be mixed with oil or glue. So the manuscript of Montpellier uses oil and rubs the mixture of binders and lead white on the ground layers by using bare hands. In contrast, the receipt in the Liber Illuminatum suggests animal glue as a binder and recommends to apply it twice. A similar layer was described much later by Pacheco, referring to it as imprimatura. Interestingly, before he uses this layer, he applies two different types of gypsum-based ground layers, where the upper one is described as having a smoother texture. Also, there is a tendency that the total of application of the ground layers should be less than if used for gilding techniques. However, in similar lines as the ones we saw before in Bivio, preparational layers for carnates on sculpture may also be pigmented in a hue that comes near to the final look of the carnate. Indications of such a layer were found in the Codex of Solothurn. Basically, it appears to be very similar to ordinary ground layer. Yet Armenian bowl is added to give it a good flesh color. Interesting about this is that even though it's not explained in which context this was actually used, it does not seem to make any sense if not for carnates. Even though it contains bowl, it would not be suitable as a preparation for gilding. This receipt therefore might hint to the fact that the carnates on sculptures are actually part of the manuscript, since a good foundation comparable to a ground layer that shows a flesh color might very well be more suitable for a sculpture. So now I'm coming to some final remarks. So Even though it seems a somehow dangerous task to forcefully look for clues in historical written sources, their inclusion into the investigation of polychromy seems to be enriching. However, many receipts and the interconnections are likely to remain subject to interpretation. To seek to find a consistent receipt for a growth period of time seems at least a little bit naive if we look on the remarkable diversity of the actual carnates still preserved. The transmission of artistic knowledge is also dependent on the respective author, however. The basic conditions are literacy, willingness to share knowledge, and expertise in the relevant techniques. It is therefore not surprising that a lot of manuscripts were apparently written in monastic context. Monasteries were the centers of education in medieval times, and the forms of art actually carried out there were more likely to be linked to illuminating techniques. The condition in a late Gothic workshop where sculptors, carpenters, and painters worked side by side might have been far less fruitful for writing purposes, however. There are evidence that at least some authors were also familiar with sculptures. The manuscripts all seem to be valuable indicators for developments and tendencies and can contribute to the understanding of the respective approach. Given the case that the pigment binders, application, and supports are rarely mentioned on the same page, the reader still has room for speculation. So still it seems reasonable to view this text as a valuable resource offering a range of tools and advices. And these advices may indeed prove be a support for the art technological research. So overall, hopefully these manuscripts will not only be viewed as somehow nebulous and unreliable. In any case, more in-depth research are highly advised to pay them justice and keep them alive for nowadays readers. So I will close with a warm thank you for your attention and will stay available for the questions afterwards.
Thank you very much, Niva. So we are now going to the third and last presentation of this panel, which I believe is related also with this presentation, right? Okay. So I will call Tiziana Tenen. Even, can you just stop sharing, please?
Yes.
Yes, I will immediately.
Thank you very much. So Tiziana Tenen graduated in 2023 with an MA in Conservation and Restoration from the University of the Arts in Bern, Switzerland. During her master's degree, she examined a retable by the German workshop of Ivo Striegel. Its centerpiece, the Virgin Mary, and the chemical and physical properties of her carnation were the main focus of her studies and remained a keen interest in her professional career. So now let's hear from Tiziana with her presentation, which is entitled The Incarnation of Carnation, a reconstruction of late Gothic flesh tones using the example of Mary, 1510, by the workshop of Ivo Striegel.
Thank you for your introduction, Sarah. I welcome you to my presentation. The title was already mentioned. The protagonist of numerous late Gothic altarpieces is the Holy Mary. One of her attributes is a porcelain skin and rosy cheeks. The creation of skin has always been a supreme discipline, but particularly in the late Middle Ages, workshops gave their sculptures carnations with an unprecedented degree of realism and liveliness. But what are the secrets behind Mary's unique polychromic attribute, and how far is our technology in its progress to understand it? Published sources focusing on flesh tones and their analytics, or merely a description of the technical execution, are exceptionally rare. It is apparent that there are still numerous uncertainties regarding the technical implementation of flesh tones, and more specifically, the paint systems used for them. A more detailed study therefore was necessary, was therefore necessary to gain a deeper understanding. Thanks to a collaboration with the Rijksmuseum in Cour, we were given the opportunity to study a late Gothic Mary attributed to the workshop of Eva Striegel. The family-owned company, located in southern Germany, produced numerous altarpieces between the late 15th and early 16th century. With the advantage of time, it was possible to examine Mary's carnation with a variety of complementary methods to create a maximum amount of information and utilize this rare opportunity the best possible way. What made this case study particularly suitable was the fact that Mary's carnation was affected by aging and previous interventions, which provided numerous areas of clearly visible stratigraphy that facilitated the sampling. Let us now turn our attention to the results of the analytical investigation that I will present to you in chronological order. The sculpture was made from lime wood. On top lays a protein-rich binder with a low oil content, which can be classified as isolation to saturate the wooden support. Afterwards, a primer was applied in varying thicknesses to the entire face. The filler contains a maritime calcium carbonate that is embedded in a protein-based binder with a low oil content. The proportion of the binder is relatively low, which creates a rather weakly bound primer that appears porous under the microscope. A pink-colored layer is now applied to the entire face, only the lips are spared. The FTIR analysis of the paint media's binder matches that of the primer, which is protein-based with a small amount of oil. The pink shade is achieved with a mixture of cinnabar and lead white with proportions of a red-colored lacquer precipitated on the basis of calcium carbonate. The layer is relatively thin but still opaque. Red circles that define the rosy cheeks were worked in at the same time, but a stronger pigmented version of the pink paint media was used instead. In the next step, a strong red-orange colorant is applied locally to the nose, chin, and eyes. The pigmentation is even more pronounced here compared to the red tint of the cheek circles. If we have a closer look at the cross-section of the nose, we can see that the locally applied red tone lies on top of the previously applied pink layer. Analytical data shows that this layer is also aqueous bound and that there is no mixing with the pink colored layer during application. This described form of a two-stage underpainting could not be documented in any other work during our research. At the current state, that system appears to be unique to the Striegel workshop. Next comes a pure layer of binder. It is once more protein-rich and contains a low oil content. It was not applied to the entire face, but only to selected areas. If we compare the cross-sections of nose, cheeks, and forehead, this isolating layer, recognizable as a small gap, can only be seen on the cheek and forehead, while it is missing on the nose. Last but not least, the final layer is applied, which defines Mary's skin color. The first time we encounter a change in the binder system. This now consists primarily of oil with a low protein content of around 2 to 4%. A shade of white with a warm undertone is achieved with a mixture of lead white and cinnabar. The paint layer on the forehead, neck, and around the cheek and chin measures around 20 micrometers and can be classified as opaque. The colorant applied on the nose is only 2 micrometers thick and appears translucent. It is low in pigment and may even be diluted with oil. If we summarize the observations made so far, we can see that Mary's carnation has at least 3 differently built areas. The intensity of the application of the white oily paint and the incorporation of the pink layer were used to achieve a variety of reds to emphasize different shades. There are areas where the paint media was applied opaque, so the pink layer is no longer visible. This is done on selected areas that have been previously isolated, allowing the oil-based paint to dry with a smooth, saturated surface without soaking of the binder. This method allows to achieve the characteristic glossy appearance typical of late Gothic carnation. We also see areas with a translucent application of the white color, namely the sections bordering the cheek circles, eyes, chin, and nose. Here, the paint media is now finely dispersed towards the center to create a gradual transition from an opaque application of paint to a slightly translucent glazed area, where the pink layer now begins to influence the shade of white with reddish undertones. Finally, we find areas with minimal or no application, and the pink layer is now fully exposed and its strong red hue becomes part of the color scheme. A technical variation was used for the nose. Since here no blocking insulation layer was applied, the binder of the very thinly applied skin tone is now partially absorbed by the pink layer, and the nose only receives a white shimmer, which creates the common reddish nose tip. Through scientific analysis, it was possible to discover two components in the binding media of the topmost skin tone to evaluate their percentage in the system as well as the pigments dispersed in them. Questions that cannot be answered analytically remained, but due to the impaired surface of the original are of great interest. In summary, these questions about the white oil-based paint media can be divided into three groups. Important is the factor of drying. How fast would such a color dry and how long is it blendable on the surface before film forming starts? And what influence does light as a secondary sedative have on the drying time? What role does viscosity play? What influence do pigments and binding media have on the viscosity and opacity of the colorant? And what concentrations are necessary to change the rheological qualities of the color so it wouldn't start to drip when applied on a vertical surface? On the same time, factors like dispersibility, homogeneity, and surface topography are of great interest. And of course, another crucial point is the surface appearance of the color. In the analyzed paint media, is the analyzed paint media glossy, semi-glossy, or matte? What influence has drying and viscosity on the surface appearance, and how is the pigment and protein concentration involved in it? To answer these questions, we choose to create an empirical practical study with the goal to find a paint media that corresponds to the results of the analysis. Further, the intention was to document changes of a colorant with increasing protein additions. Since the stated protein content of 2 to 4% of the case study only has been estimated using the relative signal intensities, films with a defined protein content can help to validate these estimates by comparing the spectra. In this presentation, we will limit ourselves to one test series as it is the most relevant. Hereby, a defined mixture of lead white pigments and sun-dried linseed oil was modified with increasing protein concentrations of egg yolk. In this case, the egg yolk represents the analyzed protein content of 2 to 4% in the binder. We carried out 10 different test rows with increasing protein contents between 0.15% to 5%. Egg yolk contains approximately 15% of protein. This means that the amount of egg yolk added is not equal with the amount of protein. It should be noted that all the materials used here are industrially produced today and may differ in certain properties from those used 500 years ago. The mixtures were processed by grinding lead white in sun-dried linseed oil with a pestle on a glass plate. Egg yolk was gradually added with a micrometric syringe, folded under with a spatula, and again grinded with a pestle. The paint media then was applied to microscopic slides with a film applicator in a layer thickness of 100 micrometers. Those paint films were dried in a light box and in daylight and then weighed in regular intervals on a high precision scale to monitor the progress of drying. The enforced drying was intended to accelerate drying and trigger the associated degradation to enable analytical and optical comparisons to the samples that dried in daylight. Film forming was documented haptically by touching the surface. Microscope slides with a pastos to translucent application using a 1 cm hog hair paintbrush were used to monitor drying of thicker paint application and to document dispersibility, homogeneity, and surface appearance. All these features were documented photographically and in charts. The drying behavior was determined pragmatically, which showed that the level of protein concentration does not have a significant effect on the speed of oxygen uptake, although the speed of drying is of course strongly dependent on external condition, in particular the light situation. But if we evaluate the speed of film formation, however, there are clearer effects regarding the addition of protein. Judged by haptical criteria, all films with a protein content of less than 1% are touchable after 12 hours. Above 2.5% even within 1.5 hours, without being tacky. This is around 5 times faster than the reference test series with the same lead white content, but without egg yolk. It is important though to differentiate between chemical drying and film formation. A comparison of film formation and changes in film weight has shown that there is no relationship between these two parameters. This means that the point at which a film is surface dry cannot be associated with a specific event such as weight loss. In particular, films with high protein content show a drastically reduced drying time, which seems to be related to the higher water content of these films coming from the egg yolk. An explanation for this phenomenon could be the partial transition from a purely chemical to a partially physical drying process. Let's look at the properties of the viscosity. Even if minimal amounts of protein are added to linseed oil, the viscosity changes visibly. At levels above 0.75%, the colorants begin to show thixotropic properties. This means that high viscosity can be temporarily reduced by shear forces, such as the use of a paintbrush, an ideal property for painting a vertical surface of a sculpture. Additions between 1% and 2.5% protein result in significant increases of the viscosity and a strong reduction in flowability, so that even highly pasturous applications applied on vertically do not drip until a film is formed. At concentrations of 3.5% protein and above, the thixotropic properties are no longer present and the formulations become pasty and difficult to apply with a brush. A correlation can also be drawn between the surface appearance and the increasing protein content. The gloss level of paintbrush application tends to increase up to a protein content of 2%, after which the surfaces become first semi-matte and after 5% completely matte. However, the thickness of paint application has a significant effect on the surface appearance. Paint applied with a paintbrush tends to be much glossier than translucent application or the films. Despite the method of preparation, all tested mixtures ended up as homogeneous emulsions with no signs of segregation. As already mentioned earlier, the stated protein content of 2 to 4% of the case study only has been estimated using the relative signal intensities of the FTIR spectrum. This assessment was possible due to my co-author's research on the measurement of proteinic compounds in temperate systems using the derivatization of sulfur tetrafluoride for the analyzed samples. The peaks of the primary amides and their amide bands 1 and 2 are decisive for the comparison of two spectra. By calculating the area of their shoulder, here marked in red, it is possible to assess whether the protein concentration of two binder systems is similar. A comparison of the spectrum by the case study with that of our color films showed that the closest match is a protein concentration of 5%, which makes the initial estimation pretty accurate. But could one of our mixtures give us an answer to the question to what Mary's skin once looked like? It is evident that the 5% mixture doesn't work as a paint media, since it is too viscous, lacks thixotropic properties, dries matte, and therefore needs to be further modified. In order to match the analytical results. One possibility would be to add water to the yolk. Own tests have shown water reduces viscosity while maintaining the thixotropic properties. If water indeed was added to the binder, of course it would be no longer measurable today, and the analyzed protein content of the binding media would be actually lower. Which brings us back to our paint medias with concentrations between 2 and 3.5%. While additional, their properties match better with the description of the carnation surface that suggests that both glazed and impasto paint applications are possible. But what surface aesthetic could be achieved with them? If we conclude our observations, that would mean opaque paint application can be finely dispersed to create smooth and shiny surfaces. But it is also possible to create translucent application that will leave a more matte to satin finish. This allows the hypothesis that Mary's carnation possibly was a contrast of satin and more glossy areas. So eventually it is possible to make a connection between the analysis, technical observations on the case study, and the tests with different paint systems in an attempt to reconstruct Mary's flesh tone. With the last slide, I'd like to thank everybody who supported us and made our project possible with their contribution. And of course, I thank my co-authors for their support and also the audience. I hope I was able to take you into the world of late Gothic skin surfaces. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Tiziana. So we are now to the discussion. So let's see here in the chat. Okay, we have a general question for the audience. Maybe I will read the question a bit later. Okay. Okay, so we have two more questions. The first, I think it was Jan.
So,
Okay, yeah.
so thank you. Thank you to all three of these papers. I was reminded of the work done on at Toulouse on Notre-Dame de Grâce in the matter of how many sequences of restorations you're dealing with, and the problem of choosing where do you stop and how do you understand the sequence of restorations. But my main comment really is to Tiziana, because in the matter of the polychromy of Greco-Roman sculpture, the skin color has been a major point of debate. And I was wondering, Tiziana, whether you are aware of a publication we have from the Glyptothek in Copenhagen from 2009, which is an investigation of the skin color, or a skin color we found on a immediately post-Parthenonic female head of the late 5th century BCE. Are you aware of this? I can't hear you. You're not on.
At the moment, it doesn't sound familiar. I've been.
I can understand perfectly, but
I would be very interested in it if there was.
But the point is that it is published in the preliminary reports of the Track and Colour project, which is accessible online. If you go to the Track and Colour website, then this preliminary report, you can find this. But the thing that is so striking listening to your presentation is that the level of sophistication in the application of the polychromy, and not only the stratigraphy, but also the fact that as you move along the surfaces of the incarnation, you see that the application is proof of a very high degree of craftsmanship, because the layers are of almost exactly the same thickness all over, which is a sign of a really great degree of command of the application. And this is what we saw on this late 5th century BCE marble sculpture. So that I mean, just as we in our field of study in Greco-Roman, just as we need you more than you need us, perhaps. But now and then it can be of great interest to make to make your reader and your colleagues aware of the fact that I mean, in the space of time of history, 1,000 years or 1,500 years is really nothing. And we have not explored. I mean, this is why the earlier intervention on El-Andalus and the whole transmission of knowledge was so intensely interesting, because we have to get much better hold of how knowledge from the levels achieved in a Greco-Roman world were actually transmitted in ways that have not been subject to anything like proper research. But I would like to thank you very much, Tiziana, and all the others in this session. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We have no question from Marcus, I think.
Yes, thank you. And congratulations to all the three panelists of this afternoon. It was very interesting. I have just a small commentary to make. I think that it was Tiziana who talked about a carnation which is tending towards great naturalism. I would be a little bit careful about this word naturalism, because unless we suppose that Mary used a very bright red lipstick, and she had very shiny shiny carnation, which would be quite surprising. We have also to take into account that female carnations are generally more white than are those of male figures, which is not the same if we look at men and women today. So I only wanted to stress this difficulty in naming things. Thank you. But nevertheless, it was really very, very interesting to listen to all your presentations.
Thank you. So we have more questions on the chat. I think the first one is from Roberta de Angelis that says, could you tell us more about the protein agglomerates that you found? I'm not sure whom this question is, but I think it was one of the last presentations. Roberta, if you can confirm to whom this question is. Okay, so if Patrick Wittmann is here saying that that was Niva that talked about the agglomerates, the protein agglomerates associated to the dyes. I think it was the alizarin.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Okay, good. Yeah, so I mean, as was also explained by Tiziana, it's sometimes you really can find traces of protein in the oily paint layer, but it was really much bigger and in agglomerates when we also had the same measurements for dye. So it was really when you were comparing like a the different methods for analyzing it. You could see like, yeah, there is, we have dye, red dye, and protein agglomerates. So yeah, it's kind of, I mean, there are different explanations for this, but what seems kind of reasonable that there are receipts suggesting that the dye can be reproduced from boiling wool fabrics, which were already kind of tinted with dye. And then you mash it up and get kind of a thick consistency, which you can use as a pigment. So you would have like the decomposed wool with like the alizarin surrounding it. So you would have like the dye surrounding the substrate, which is, yeah, the boiled wool, basically.
Thank you, Niva. I think we have another question on the chat, which is, what was the binding agent of Saint Elizabeth statue? So Roberta is saying that, yes, that is what I meant. I am asking because I found the same and gave the same interpretation. Thank you. So, thank you very much. Isabel, do you have a question?
Yes, Niva, could you please tell me what is Paris red?
Paris red.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, sometimes it's not really clear. It can be linked to different kind of substances, but mostly it's like a plant-based one. Like, for example, there are descriptions for Brazil wood, or is the right expression madder, I guess? Madder. But sometimes, yeah, it also could be like cochineal. But it's just, it seems to refer to kind of any kind of red dye.
So you don't understand how it got the name. So the terminology is.
It's under discussion. I mean, some people say that it's really kind of, they link it to Paris, but this really could be wrong. It's also, what was it again? Like, it's kind of a plant. I don't know, like, which was described as the paradise plant. How is it called actually in English? Like this grape, this little. If you cut it, you have like little red things. So they say that the color is similar to this one, but yeah, that's one interpretation where the terminology derived from. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Okay, so while there is no other questions, I will make a question to, I think, to Niva and Tiziana, to both of you. That is there any information, do you have any information on how the workshop of Ivo Striegel was organized? I'm asking this because in the morning we were speaking of who was painting, who was sculpting, it's the workshop of the painter, the sculptor, and so on. Do you have information on that?
Niva, do you want to answer that?
No. I can start and you can add your knowledge if you like. Yeah, I mean, that's also kind of I guess, yeah, there's a lot of controversy and discussions going on. I mean, like Ivo Striegel was supposed to be like the founder and the one who really made it big, but the sculptures we were analyzing, at this time he was already dead. So there's a real discussion going on, who was actually the master or who were the people really working there, because yeah, it could be that in this time a lot of changes were going on, and yeah, we really don't know for sure who was doing the the Carnet painting. There are ideas of Hans Goldschmidt could be one of them, but yeah, it's also, I mean, because we had these two altarpieces where we're doing research which really nearly dated with only a little time gap, but they were so differently composed. I mean, the diversity is really strong, so it's not very plausible to think that the same person would have painted it, but yeah, we really don't know for sure.
So thank you very much. Barbara is saying here, it's pomegranates, about the question we were discussing before.
Pomegranates, that's it. I guess so, yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so there are no more questions for these presenters? No? Okay, so maybe before we finish this panel, I will read the comments that Diana de Bellay wrote at lunchtime. She said, hi, I work at the National Museums of Scotland. I have a question for all the presenters and audience, but related to the talk regarding the relationship between painters and carvers. I have worked on a Trecento polychrome Madonna and Child from Umbria, Abuso, in which we found an underdrawing in black directly on the wood. Is this something any of you have seen? It was evident particularly on the eyes of the figures, but also the lineations on the Virgin stunning. Our conjecture was that this may have been a form of communication between carver to painter. So if anyone has some information on this, I have never seen any underdrawing until now. Okay, so no one can help Diana de Bellay. We are very sorry, but we will all be attentive to this question, and if something comes up, we will certainly tell you. So thank you very much. I think there is no more comments. Okay, so I will finish this session then. I believe we have a break now, right, Isabel? Yes.
Yes, we will have a break now. So we will be back at 4. So see you at 4 Lisbon time.
Yeah. Thank you very much to all the speakers and to the audience.
Hello again. We will start now with the final panel of today. I must say that we just received an email from the last author saying that it won't be able to be here. However, we've received a recording of a presentation that was supposed to happen yesterday from Maria Julia Palma. And so I will play her presentation after this one. I want to welcome the authors that are present and the moderator. Thank you very much, Marcus, for accepting our invitation. And the screen is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Isabel, and thank you for having me this opportunity to introduce some of your speakers here to this very interesting conference. I am very happy to introduce to you Kristina Sparschuh and Elena Platania from the Norwegian Institute for Cultural Heritage Research. Kristina Sparschuh has trained as a conservator for paintings and polychrome sculpture at the Technical University of Munich. Since 2005, she has worked as a conservator and researcher at the Norwegian Institute for Cultural Heritage Research in Oslo. In recent years, she carried out much research on the polychromy of English alabaster altar pieces. She will talk to us today does Elena Platania present with you, Kristina?
No, she doesn't.
So I will just say that she is a conservation scientist and makes part of the team of Christina Sparschu at the NICU at Oslo. So Christina Sparschu will talk to us today on Pastilla Relief and Sgraffito, a study of the polychromy on a late medieval English alabaster altarpiece. As some of you may know, I cherish very much English alabaster panels and altar pieces, and thanks to Christina Sparschu, we can get a much better knowledge of these English altar pieces kept in Iceland, quite far away from Central Europe, and which are still very poorly known. Yet Iceland is the country where we find, if we accept France, the highest number of English altar pieces, and they are often better preserved than in most other countries. So I am very curious to hear you, and I will leave you the word, Christina. Thank you a lot, Christina. In any case, for me, it will give much matter to go on discussing about these matters. I hope also for the audience. And but we will discuss after the second presentation, which will be a video which that Isabel will launch. It is in fact a presentation that we were ought to hear yesterday, which is entitled "From the a taste which unfoundedly believed to be ancient is instead unique to us, from removal to rediscovery of polychromy in sculptures." And the talk comes from Julia Maria Palma. Now, Julia Maria Palma is a PhD student in archaeology and history of art at the University Lumière Lyon 2 in France, with a research project on crypts in the region of Umbria, Tuscany, and Lazio. She's graduated from the University of Viterbo and collaborates regularly with professor and architect Renzo Chiovelli. So I think I will immediately give the initiative to Isabel to let us hear this presentation.
A taste which, unfoundedly believed to be ancient, is instead unique to us, from removal to rediscovery of polychromy in sculptures of the Romanesque crypt of Tuscia. In the mid-70s of the last century, a young assistant professor of history of architecture at the University of Rome, drafting his first volume of a series of texts that would open up new perspectives in the field of architectural restoration, in the wake of those theories which, starting from the post-war period in the face of significant war destruction, aimed to overcome the philological scientific position, evolving towards what was called critical restoration, to arrive at more recent critical conservative positions, denounced the established habits, critically inconsistent, to accentuate the materiality of the interiors according to a taste which, unfoundedly believed to be ancient, is instead unique to us. The medievalist scholar and restoration theorist, who today goes by the name of Giovanni Carbonara, certainly needs no introduction in denouncing the zeal of the restorers intent on decorticating and cleansing the surface of historic buildings from the fragments of colorful original decorative wall decorations, was mainly referring to interiors of generally medieval architecture and, in particular, of the centuries in central southern Italy, which are better preserved, especially if they have escaped the care of the restorers. One can find almost constantly the habit of extending above a general plastering a continuous thickly colored decoration, which also affect the plastic and sculptural elements. Establishing that the dematerialized also due to the effect of the particular light conditions, and on the other qualified as essentially coloristic. Continuing as, unfortunately, through a philological and neutral restoration scrapple, the stones of the internal wall equipment are currently brought into view, removing, without any analysis or stratigraphy, together with the plaster and the final whitewashing, precious evidence of previous decorations, stripping ancient monuments, due to an undue superimposition of taste of their decorative skin, and proposing to us was what remains as an authentic image. The consequences of these operations, which unfortunately have not yet completely ceased, contrary to the false expectations of these restorers, and up far from coinciding with the original idea of the medieval interior. According to the most recent studies on the medieval mentality, the undisputed predominance of the religious vision that the entire society of those centuries had of the world was aimed at relegating material reality to a condition of inferiority and subordination with respect to spiritual life, and which therefore, although present, had to undergo a sort of transcendental sublimation. As Gurevich states, medieval man, in dealing with the world around him, measures its space through his ability to influence matter, and it is through the material and the symbolic visible that he tends to represent the invisible and the rational concept of the world of superior essences, for the sole purpose of glorifying the Lord, per vivia ad invisibilia. Precisely by addressing the problem of the drastic scrapings of the internal architectural surfaces with their ancient colors, Carbonara gives the example of homogeneous series of Romanesque crypts in Tuscia, which in other ways had already been the subject of study by the historian Eugenio Battisti. Observing how the original effect of decorative and colorful richness that must have characterized these medieval crypts can still be captured in the vaults of the crypt of Santa Maria de Caiano, later called San Francesco, in Vetralla, in which he notes a prevalence of reds and blacks, colors that can also be found in the nearby crypts of San Pietro a Norcia, despite it being in a state of complete abandonment and ruin. While, however, he denounces how the crypts which, like Sutri and Tuscania, have had their plasters removed are not counted. Only recently conducted by the undersigned as a campaign of investigation, survey, laboratory analysis, restitution of computerized images, and communication that began aimed at the conservation and valorization of the original polychrome medieval world in which the crypts of Upper Lazio area were immersed of Tuscia. For a long time, the Middle Ages were thought of as a dark century in which even colors, except in particular creation, stained glass, miniatures, mosaics, frescoes, must have been completely absent. Recent studies, such as the one being conducted on the internal surface of the crypts of Tuscia, have instead shown how the architecture of the Middle Age was an era of strong colors, also in the field of color, particularly in ecclesiastical buildings, considered the area in which the highest level of color appears and around which the most stated debates took place between chromophile and chromophobe theologians, depending on whatever they considered color as light or as matter. Even in the homogeneous group of Romanesque oratorium crypts which during the 12th century characterized the underground environments of the main churches of the heritage of San Pietro in Tuscia, we witnessed, especially between the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 12th century, to a systematic scraping operation of the architectural surfaces to make the stone walls completely exposed. For a coloristic analysis of the crypt of Tuscia, it's preferable to start from the crypt of the church currently called San Francesco a Vetralla, the only one in which decoration of the vaults has largely been preserved. The dating of the crypts should be ascribed to the decades of the 12th century, while the entire church was probably not yet finished in 12 of 7. The crypt, divided into 6 naves, presents a rich decorative apparatus in various colors, essentially in colors on the surfaces of the vaults that cover it, which in some cases are ribbed. A good part of these ornamentations are still clearly visible, while others are hidden by superior whitewashing, and still others may now be definitively lost. The execution of the paintings, which, like the different from each other, the construction of the crypts does not seem very accurate and is quite careful, presents several motifs that are different from each other, but which contribute in terms of the works and themes to making the whole ensemble homogeneous. The faces of the introducts on the square section ribs present on 6 cross vaults are decorated in different ways, such as, for example, with a series of circles alternately colored green, red and yellow. In other ribs, however, within these circles, double-styled raisins appear which sinuously converge from the sides of the center, giving life to a lily inflorescence. Even in each of these circles, and colors already mentioned and are repeated. For example, combining green with the circle, red with the branch, and yellow with the central lily. Normally, these 3 colors alternate to form the various ornamental designs present on all the ribs. In the case of some circles, we'll have only a lily in the center. or in other circles with a black outline with 4 petals arranged in a cross inside, with a disc red center and large round petals alternately red and green, or of other heart-shaped shoots with the shape of 5 lobed leaves inside of a regular green vegetal intertwinings, enriched with more minute details in red or in the series of racemes shaped like them that chase each other along the extension of the rib face. In some arches, dividing the spans of other racemes, chasing each other instead, contouring like a hook and alternating in green and red colors. The rhomboid motifs, on the other hand, are purely geometric in nature, with black outlines which form a continuous zigzag series, always along the lower face of the rib, with a color sequence that fills each rhombus according to an alternation of red, yellow, green, in so that the lighter and brighter yellow color always separated the other 2 darker toned colors. In other case, for each of these spans, a parallel series of wave lines was the overpainting in red on the yellow and green backgrounds, or in green on the red backgrounds. The vegetal motifs present both on the dividing arches between the spans and also fill in the face of the portions of the wall that connect these arches to vaults appear of a different sign. These seem to have been traced by a more confident and rapid hand, which has outlined with clear contours sinuous floral compositions from which emerge berries and larger yellow floral composition, the latter protruding from bed bases. On other arches delimiting the base, the aforementioned circular motifs appear again, this time in the form of shoots containing plants with lanceolate leaves inside, in whose components elements the yellow, red and green colors still alternate. The backgrounds on which all these decorations unfold are exclusively painted with white lime, and the various ornamentations that develop along the ribs always start from a circular motif created at the top of the walls, the intersection of the ribs. Furthermore, a common feature of all the ribs is that being surrounded along the entire length of the edges by red beds struck on both faces perpendicular to each other. In addition to those of the ribs, the Vitralla crypt also have extensive decoration on the walls, whether ribbed or not. These are always large circumference enclosing within concentric circles large flowers with simple or lobed petals, with a central disc that is normally red but also filled with white dots. Around the red disc, flower petals and the backgrounds alternate the colors yellow, green and white. It often appears and more precise thanks to a trace made by means of a light furrow in the whitened plaster made with a pointed instrument tied by a string fixed to the center of the circle. Within one of these large painted circles, normally enclosing flower, or one can instead see a series of concentric circles engraved on the plaster in the aforementioned manner, which however were not used to be painted. It seems clear that the entire decorative apparatus of the vaults of the Vetralla crypt was created apparently using only 3 colors, yellow, red and green, but in reality using also black, used for some contour and in other details, and white for the backgrounds, but also within the floral composition. In fact, these are the colors that made up the most common chromatic axis, heir to Aristotelian knowledge, rediscovered during the 12th century, the period of construction of the oratorium crypts of Tuscia, and taught until the second half of the 17th century, that is, until the discovery of Newton's spectrum with its fundamental and complementary colors, but which had to wait until the 19th century to establish themselves. The most common medieval chromatic axis saw 6 basic colors following one another in order: white, yellow, red, green, blue and black. Of all these colors, only blue is missing in the Vetralla crypt, but it must be said that this color only began to establish itself starting from 1140, and then gained much greater fortune during the 13th century. Moving on to the nearby crypt of the ruined church of San Pietro Norcia, which probably dating back to the mid-12th century, must have served as a model for that of Vetralla, as its more regular plan, badly reproduced in the example of San Francesco, shows it was possible to see from the remains of the walls how evident traces of a bright yellow color are preserved, supported by light plaster spread on the surface of the regular tough ashlars. The other crypts examined, also dating back to the mid-12th century, also highlighted the presence of remains of colors which attest, albeit partially, to the original colors. In sutri, traces of color are present on the capitals, among which the yellow that covered the cowl of the Corinthian capital is evident. The same thing can be said for the Nepi crypt, in which part of the zoomorphic figures on the capitals appear whitewashed, and with sections reworked with red lines. This is a characteristic common to other colors of sculptural parts present in the crypts, such as the of Sant'Andrea in the Viterbo district of Pianoscarano, where the red brushstrokes underline the ribs of whitened foliage, which are part of the capitals of the semi-columns placed along the internal walls of the building. The crypt of Sant'Andrea, however, was more characterized by a rich decoration, as well as pictorial, of which fragments remain with figure on the 3 panels. Finally, we want to propose the most studied case of the colors of the crypt of the Basilica of the Holy Sepulchre of Acquapendente, inside which a copy of the Jerusalem edicule is preserved, considered the oldest remaining today of the destroyed Constantinian original, being traced back to the century. The crypt was rebuilt around the memory of the chapel at the same time as the 3-nave upper basilica during the first half of the 12th century, and both were consecrated in 1149. The crypt by the Bishop of Orvieto Aldobrandino, and the upper church by Eugene III. Also in this case, a careful examination of the surface of the walls, columns and vaults of the crypts, today all completely exposed tuff and basaltic stone, reveal the presence of evident traces of whitewashing, plaster and colored plaster, which, at least on the internal perimeter walls, in which most of the elements are made of tuff, can give a reconstructive idea of what the monument must have looked like when it was completely decorated. In this regard, a series of microsamples of this colored surface was taken in order to characterize their constituent materials and the execution technique through the laboratory investigation. The construction techniques was investigated through the study of the polished section of the sample, observed under the optical mineralogical microscopy in white light and in ultraviolet fluorescence, while the constituent materials were investigated through spectroscopic techniques, in particular through X-ray, fluorescence spectroscopy, and spectroscopy. inferior in Fourier transform. This results in the use of earth for the creation of the red and yellow pictorial layers found on semicolons and capitals. In fact, the analysis revealed the presence of hematite, iron oxide, which colors the red ochre, and geotite, ferric hydroxyl, which gives the color of yellow ochre. The whites, however, present on all the background mirror of the perimeter walls, but also on the half columns and capitals, are made with the calcium carbonate, while the black, with which the fake joints of the paint wall equipment covering the real one were created in blocks of tuff of the walls, was found to be made up of carbon of vegetal origins, as it was possible to observe under the microscope the typical yellow ochre. Elongated particles in the shape of flakes produced by the combustion of process of vegetal material, which generally consists of twigs of vine, from which the name vine black given to this type of pigment derives. These black lines, representing the fake commissures, were spread on a white preparation based on chalk, calcium carbonate and glue, which covered the back walls of the crypt. In general, however, in all of the same examines, the presence of chalk and protein substances was also found, given that the latter had to ensure the function of binder for the pigments and for the preparation. Having identified the materials, the constituent colors and their distribution on the various architectural parts of the crypt, a sort of virtual restoration was attempted, reconstructing on the computer how it should have appeared, and, at least, as regards the background coloring, a portion of the tough perimeter walls, with its architectural guise, from the right arm of the transept of the underground room, where the fragments of color on site allowed a more accurate and documentable representation. The result is surprising to say the least, especially for the brilliance of the colors used, but we must not forget that in medieval times the true and beautiful colors were the bright, brilliant, saturated and luminous ones, which were supposed to give life and joy. Furthermore, for the chromophile prelates and theologians, who were the most numerous, color was light, clarity, heat, which had to enter massively into the church, evidently even more so in its most underground and darkest place. Thank you for your attention.
So I don't know exactly how to proceed. Thank you in any case for this.
Questions for Christina?
Yes.
I think we should.
Yes. In any case, yes. It's just about this last presentation. I think even if the presenter isn't present, it is very interesting for several reasons. I think we don't have talked much about this color sequence rediscovered by medieval the medieval clergy and theologians in the 12th century, which go from white to yellow, red, and so on. And maybe this could be an important subject of discussion. Also, the importance of reconstruction of the reconstruction of polychromy, if it is very poorly conserved, as is the case with these scripts, but it is certainly much more simple to discuss with Christina Sparschu, because she is here. So I give the word to the audience if there are any questions.
Yeah, and I would just like to add that if someone has questions to Julia Maria Palma, they can write them in the chat, and then afterwards I can send to the author, or if she joins us tomorrow, we can discuss tomorrow. So feel free to write questions on the chat for her too. and we can discuss it later.
If there's, I don't see any question. So I will maybe start with one of them to Christina Sparschow in any case. I wondered if the pastilla or what is the matter, the constituting matter of the drops, the white drops? Is it alabaster powder or is it another kind of plaster? Do you manage, do you arrive to identify and to analyze these objects, the pastilla?
Yeah, the pastilla on the frame was chalk.
Chalk.
Yeah, but we didn't manage to analyze the binding medium, I'm afraid.
Okay. So
it's not like in the case of on the alabaster reliefs. It's often, as I've understood, gypsum or just alabaster powder. But in this case, we analyzed only chalk, not gypsum. But then it's also applied on top of another ground layer. So it's a different matter.
Okay, thank you. Isabella?
I was wondering because the treatment that they gave to the alabaster is quite different for the frames and the alabaster itself. So do you have any idea if it was the same workshop that was doing that, or you had, you know that it was not the same people doing that, or because it's very interesting. They are using very different techniques. So.
Well, the techniques, well, in a way, they are not that different since there's both sgraffito, for example, used on the alabaster and on the frame. And that's what I didn't mention, for example, is there's also carmine analyzed on the frame sgraffito. Otherwise, your question is very interesting. I myself haven't looked into that at all. I don't have the possibility to that, but as I've understood from literature, they think that these frames were made in England, not the alabaster slabs transported to other countries, and then they made these frames in the country itself. I guess they think that the workshop also stood also made the frames for the alabaster slabs. There's also these usually these marks on the rear side of the alabaster slabs, which gives information about how, at least that's what people literature believes, that they give information about how these alabaster slabs should be placed in the frame. Yeah, but I don't really have any news on that myself. Maybe Markus Schlicht can say something about that. Have you studied that?
No, I didn't study it personally, but if I remember well from, I think it was Cheetham, he noticed that in one case we have information that the alabaster workshop acquired the wood from a joiner, but he acquired it. So what do we have to conclude? did they assemble the woodwork, or was it already furnished by a joiner? In any case, I think here really we have a separation. We have a specialization between two different types of workers, the joiner at the one hand and the alabaster carver on the other. I don't think that the alabaster men were really preparing or constructing their woodwork. However, they might very well have painted it, because we know from the sources, from the written sources, that some of the alabaster carvers painted also their works. So they were very familiar with polychromy, and they very well knew how to do it, now how to applicate and how to polychrome their works.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Yes, Sarah?
No. Christina, I was just asking myself, because I think you said, but I probably missed. What is the composition of the red preparation layer? The red paint?
You mean on the frame?
Yes, yes.
I just have to think a second. The red, the lowest, and the cross section is approximately the same as the orange, which must be some kind of mordant for the gilding, and with mainly red lead. But there's also elements analyzed which can point to that also a clay-based pigment, also a red bull, maybe mixed in.
Okay, thank you.
Of these layers, the red and the orange layer, we couldn't really differentiate between, which is interesting in itself. But maybe it's the quality of the red lead that was the different one, or maybe the amount of the red bull,
Yeah,
or
the proportion of the pigments.
was just.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sorry if you, yeah, I was talking too fast, perhaps.
There's a question on the chat also.
I think you, yes. But the answer has already been given, Miss, I think.
Yeah, it's Karman as it's cochineal we identified. And as I've understood from Elena, I'm not an expert on these things, but as I understood from her and from literature, since we find camenic acid and camesic acid, this can point to this Polish, so-called Polish cochineal, which came from a larger area than Poland. We think of today in East Europe, and because the American cochineal seems to be imported only later on, after the after America was how do you say,
discovered.
Thank you.
So if there are not any other questions, I will render the word to Isabel.
Thank you very much, Marcus. The moderators are being wonderful. Thank you to all of you. Also because you did a wonderful job because you are from the scientific committee, and I must say that you were the ones that chose the papers. It was not the organizing committee. I will say that tomorrow again. So thank you very much to you all, and we will see you tomorrow at 9 Lisbon time.
Mhm.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you too. Good evening. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
This work stems from a research project on colonial altarpieces in Cusco developed at the Research and Heritage Conservation Center of the University of Engineering and Technology, UTEC, Lima, Peru, since 2020. Approached from an interdisciplinary perspective, it is presented through three main axes: historical documentary research, the study of some scattered pieces in the Andean region of Cusco to contextualize them within the desired timeframe, and the scientific analysis of materials to identify cochineal dye as part of the pictorial palette. Finally, we will cross-reference information to approach Cusco sculpture of this period. As for sculpture production in the Cusco region, historiography indicates that from the time of the conquest, 1532, until the arrival of Viceroy Francisco de Toledo, 1569 to 1581, there was little production due to the social and political instability caused by colonization processes and civil wars. However, towards the late 16th century, there was a notable migration of artists to the highlands of Peru, including Cusco, with the aim of reaching Potosi. During this time, urban life was restored, religious orders were established, indigenous parishes were built, and works began to be endowed to their temples. Regarding the technique and materiality of the few works recognized as belonging to this period, historiography highlights the sculpture of the Lord of the Earthquakes as representative and significant of this era, emphasizing its technique, where the image is hollow inside. However, recent studies demonstrate that this image has a new Spanish origin, where techniques and materials typical of those latitudes were used. Thus, this research leaves this temporality without representatives and dismantles the pillar upon which the history of Cusco's viceregal sculpture was built. However, it is evidence of the early commercial relationship with a new Spanish viceroyalty. From recent studies on sculpture and altarpieces in the Andean region, a large number of pieces have been identified along the old royal road that connected Huancavelica with Potosi, passing through the city of Cusco, opening up new avenues of study that documentary research has not been able to address. Therefore, we approach the pieces through a study of their techniques, manufacturing processes, and circulation of inputs provided by the works themselves and parallel documentation, with the purpose of weaving a more open panorama for the history of Cusco sculpture. Based on the aforementioned previous studies, we have managed to characterize the technique and materiality of Andean works from the early years of the 17th century, leading us to suspect that their technical peculiarity stems from a tradition developed during the second half of the 16th century. As a summary of these conclusions, we can mention that the main structure is formed by joining several floral stalks of maguey, which, after being stripped of their bark, are joined with wooden dowels, bark from the same plant, ropes, and/or glues, to form blocks. These blocks are carved and bound with a textile, usually of fine weave linen, closely following the technique of sculpture in harder woods. Once the structure is built, which has the quality of being lightweight, a very fine preparation base of calcium sulfate, that is, plaster, is applied. Depending on the final finish, there could be a layer of iron oxide or Armenian bole, intended to receive the gold leaf, or in other cases various glazes for flesh tone areas. As we can see, in this process, despite the peculiar materiality of maguey as a support, the finish is similar to what is known for carvings in harder woods. Although we have numerous sculptural examples that allow us to observe the techniques employed, historiography has not given them the visibility they deserve due to their absence in historical documentation. That's why we turn to the documentation obtained from studies conducted on the altarpieces of Cusco to approach these contemporary objects that share the same materiality, techniques, and, in some cases, the same artisans who move between painting, sculpture, and altarpiece making. In 1581, following the construction of the altarpiece made by Diego Rodriguez in the Temple of La Merced in Cusco, Antonio Ponce was called upon to gild it. The details of the contract, located in the Regional Archive of Cusco, provide clarifications that help us contextualize the techniques and materials applied in the region during this period, alongside what was happening in other Hispanic territories. Among the data we extract from this contract, we highlight the instructions for the previous layers to prepare the surface of the wood, emphasizing that
primeramente se han de endentrar todas las juntas y hendiduras de los tableros y de toda la demás obra, y endentrar todo el retablo con cola fresca y plastecer los clavos y juntas y hendiduras y lo demás que tuviere necesidad, conforme a buena obra, y aparejar el dicho retablo de dicho material grueso y delgado y darle las manos que convengan, hasta que esté en perfección de buena obra.
In this way, when the glue was hot, it was applied to all the wood of the altarpiece, allowing the fibers to expand to ensure that the successive layers of gesso adhere. Also, the contract details that the gilding had to be well covered and polished, leaving only the faces, feet, and hands ungilded, which referred to the fact that within the motifs there were naturalistic sculptural elements that corresponded to compositions described later in the document as Roman and brocade patterns and grainings woven with undersides of different colors, so that the work is perfect, visually striking, and in accordance with good craftsmanship. In the same document, it is also clarified that the entire work should be estofado, applying colors and designs over the gold of the friezes, columns, capitals, festoons, cornices, and finials. Additionally, it sheds light on the recurrence of imagery reliefs on the benches and panels, which will be with the colors that each figure requires. Likewise, it specifies that the main niche, referred to as the box where the figure of Our Lady should be placed, must be entirely gilded, with the color that seems best, and above it, the Roman motifs. In the same way that the technique is described in detail in this contract, the document specifies the list of materials that Antonio Ponce should use as part of the fulfillment and which should be closely related to the quality of the work. Among these, the use of fine colors from Castilla is mentioned, such as azul esmalt y cenizas, ginolis, azarcon, vermelon, albiol, grana de Mexico. From this list, we highlight the mention of grana from Mexico, which refers to carmine, the intense red pigment and dye whose organic composition derives from cochineal, and which is what brings us now to consider its use and presence in pieces contemporary to the vanished altarpiece of La Merced. Although the altarpiece referred to in the documentation has not survived to our days, we approach the preserved remnants of contemporary works in other venues located in the city of Cusco to explore the recurrence of the use of this material. Within the temple of La Compañía de Jesus in Cusco, there is a candlestick that has gone unnoticed in the history of art, corresponding to a fragment of a reused column. Its design reminds us of the models prevalent during the 1580s, as it can be compared with the columns of the main altarpiece of Huejotzingo, Mexico, dated between 1580 and 1586, as well as with the civilian models from which both cases possibly draw inspiration and which are part of the visual repertoire of the late 16th century, as illustrated by the column in Wanda Arf y Villafani's treatise published in 1585. These cases are just comparative examples of the formal diffusion that the models had in the Hispano-American world and that surely permeated the visual capital of artisans of the time. With these formal arguments, it is possible to temporally situate this piece and perhaps relate it to the main altarpiece that housed the first Jesuit temple. We have some information about the artisans of this work, Pedro Vargas and Bernardo Bitti, to whom the disappeared altarpiece of the Compañía de Jesus in Cusco is attributed. From both artisans, we know that Pedro de Vargas was a Jesuit who collaborated closely with his brother in both order and art. Bernardo Bitti. Their relationship not only extended to the religious sphere but also shared a profound professional trajectory and admiration for each other's work. According to a letter signed by Vargas himself in 1585, which mentions his foray into sculpture, we can glimpse the dedication and talent that both artists devoted to their craft. I made, at the Jesuit College of Lima, the main altarpiece and others for a chapel. The main one is admirable. Of these altarpieces, the brother Bernardo made the brushwork, which are some panels. He does it admirably. It was necessary to make us more than painters, because we made all the carving and beautiful figures, and I did all the gilding engraving afterwards. Later, he reports that Brother Bernardo came to Cusco to begin another altarpiece, where he stayed for a year and a half, and he made the brushwork panels he carries and some figures in the round and half relief, and he left it like that because the provincial fathers sent him to Julie and Chiquiavo. Therefore, Vargas clarifies that he ended up making many figures in the round and half relief, and then gilding and engraving it. Currently, of this work, Bitti's paintings are preserved in the Temple of Rondecan in Cusco, as well as the reliefs located in the Regional Museum of Cusco, and we propose that Vargas's participation is likely greater than Bitti's, or at least his polychromy, if we consider the notes from his letter. It's worth noting that the technique of these reliefs follows the structural model previously described for sculptures of the period in question. However, it's important to point out that this method was adapted to the relief's condition. In this particular case, the horizontal support consists of a wooden paneling onto which maguey boards are attached. These boards are then carved and linked to receive gilding and polychrome, thus showcasing a combination of materials and techniques that reflect the adaptability of the artists. This process not only highlights technical skill and adaptation in the face of apparent absence of wood or practicality in application, but also offers a more comprehensive understanding of material appropriation processes. Based on the reference dates provided by Vargas in his letter regarding the construction of the altarpiece, it is proposed that these works could have been executed between approximately 1583 and 1587, coinciding with the column we now present, which helps us visually reconstruct the possible typology of the disappeared altarpiece of the Compañía de Jesus. This information is used to reconstruct a complex network and understand the documentary, technical, formal, and material relationships that link Cusco painting, sculpture, and altarpiece production from the late 16th century. With the same purpose, microscopic samples were obtained from the column of the former altarpiece of the Compañía de Jesus, which were subjected to scientific studies. The first of these samples is extracted from an area identified with a high chromatic presence of red, and another from the flesh tone of one of the female characters decorating the column. Both are now identified as altarpiece red drapery and altarpiece red carnation. In both samples, as we will see later on, the presence of cochineal dye has been sought. By finding it, we could confirm its presence and its recurrent use within the artistic circles flourishing in Cusco. In this way, it will be possible to offer a broader overview of its circulation within the groups of painters, from Antonio Ponce at the time of executing the finishes of the altarpiece of La Merced, to Pedro de Vargas and Bernardo Bitti in the altarpiece of the Society of Jesus. Furthermore, regarding Bitti and the use of this pigment, we have subjected microsamples extracted from the canvases now located in the Temple of Rondecan, which belong to the same altarpiece of the Compañía de Jesus in Cusco, sample Bitti, red in canvas. The selected samples underwent laboratory analysis using spectroscopic techniques. X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy, XRF, was employed on one hand, while Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy, FDIR, was used on the other hand to identify the compounds and specifically the presence of cochineal dye in the mentioned samples. This approach aims to deepen our understanding of its use in artworks from the 16th century and to confirm the dialogue we seek to establish between historical documents, preserved material pieces, cultural context, and the circulation of this material within the recognized artistic sphere of the time. The FDIR spectrum of commercial cochineal or carminic acid, C22H20O13, is shown in the figure. We focused on the most intense signals to evaluate the presence of cochineal in the study samples. These signals are related to the vibration of the bonds CH, carbon and hydrogen. We can see in the left figure a similarity in profile and in peak location between the study samples, gray lines, and the cochineal, red line. We also evaluated the possible presence of other binders such as chia oil, linseed oil, rabbit skin glue, and gelatin. We can see in right figure that the peak locations of the binders differ from those of cochineal. This information allows us to suggest that cochineal is present in the study samples. The bidired in canvas sample presents a high concentration of lead, Pb. This suggests the use of white lead or lead white as the matrix for the application of cochineal dye. In the case of the other two samples, altarpiece, red, robe, and altarpiece, red, carnation, the high presence of calcium is related to the material of the preparation layer applied on the wood carving, and the traces of iron may correspond to the so-called bole armenico, commonly used to receive the different finishing layers. The altarpiece carnation sample presents a high percentage of calcium, the highest percentage of sulfur, and a low percentage of lead. However, the altarpiece robe sample presents high concentrations of calcium and lead. The information obtained from both studies confirms the presence of cochineal in the works associated with the artistic activities of Bernardo Bitti and Pedro de Vargas. Additionally, with the complementary information regarding the identification of cochineal, we can gain insight into the technique and usage across various mediums. On one hand, the presence of lead in the painting sample, Bitti, red on canvas, suggests the use of white lead or lead white as the matrix used for the application of cochineal dye. In the case of the other two samples, altarpiece, red, robe, and altarpiece, red, carnation, the high presence of calcium is related to the material of the preparation layer applied on the wood carving, and the traces of iron may correspond to the so-called bole armenico, commonly used to receive the different finishing layers. We are aware of studies that recognize the presence of cochineal in the pre-Hispanic era of Peru and in colonial art, including examples such as Queros, the Virgin of Copacabana in Bolivia, or 18th century mural painting. However, the discovery of Antonio Ponce's contract, which we reference, provides the first documented evidence of cochineal's presence within the palette of artisans in the 16th century in Cusco. We also acknowledge that there are still unanswered questions that will continue in future studies and will further expand our understanding of cochineal's presence in other artworks, artists, and time periods in the Andean Viceroyalty. At the same time, doubts will remain about the extent to which Mexican cochineal was used and its application, as suggested by the referenced contract. Even with these uncertainties, with the results of the analyses of the extracted samples, we obtain sufficient evidence to corroborate the presence of cochineal in various artistic supports of the time. We understand that its application is present within the most influential circles of art at the time, and that mentioning a specific origin, in this case Mexican, carries an intentionality. From this study, we can observe that Grana de Mexico quickly gained fame in the South American territory. Although we are not clear on the difference in quality between Mexican cochineal and the one likely produced in Peru, we believe that its status was more subject to the social values assigned to the origin of the material than to the physical characteristics presented by products from both origins. In this way, it is possible to recognize its early application in Cusco's art in the sculptural sphere and within the works of the first artists to arrive in the Andes, such as in the main altarpieces of Cusco's principal temples and in the context of the prominent names of the time, such as Bernardo Bitti, Antonio Ponce, and Pedro Vargas. With this data, this work fits into the proposals of study regarding the exchanges related to art between American territories and calls for attention to them. Additionally, we highlight the regional value of pigments, which goes beyond their physical properties, as it is very possible that the quality was the same as that of a locally sourced product. In this case, The specificity of origin of each color, such as from Castilla or from Mexico, confers it a particular quality, a regional identity as a product foreign to its place of application. We propose that objects, despite being locally made, in this case Cusco, acquire the values conferred to the region of origin of the materiality with which they are constituted. By observing the material, the object from this perspective, regardless of whether it is made in Cusco, gains a sign of distinction and peculiarity within the hierarchy of social spheres. In this way, the material is imbued with a social condition, becoming a resource of distinction both for the artist and for the possessor of the artworks. Thank you for your attention.